I'm Elizabeth at A Literary Princess, and today I am doing my October wrap-up, which is also my Victober wrap-up because I almost exclusively read Victorian literature this month. There is one exception, and I will talk about that one at the end, even though I finished it fairly early on in the month. But we'll do the Victorian books first. First up was the one piece of nonfiction I read. This is The Subjection of Women by John Stuart Mill. So I read this for my feminist theory list, and I didn't really know what to expect. I hadn't read any of it before. I was thinking it would be a bit more like A Vindication of the Rights of Women by Mary Wollstonecraft, who was writing in 1790 something, I think. So about half a century before this. Maybe even a full century. I don't remember when this was published. Anyway, this ended up being a lot less dense than I thought it would be, and just really applicable. Like, if I had been highlighting it, I would have highlighted basically the entire book, because everything he was saying, I was just like, yeah, so this is his argument for why women should be given more rights, including the right to vote, the ability to pursue professions, all of which was pretty much barred to them in the Victorian era, with the exception of working class women were able to work in servant roles, etc. But middle class and upper class women were completely barred from working unless it was as a governess. So, and they couldn't vote at all, only men could vote. So this is his argument of why they should be given these rights and how basically the way they've been treated is an absolute travesty. So this was fantastic. I gave this 4 stars. Next up, I did some poetry. This was for one of the challenges. It was Roz's challenge to read a work of Victorian poetry, and I had quite a bit of Victorian poetry I needed to read, and this was the first of them. And this did not go great. So this was the selected poems of Robert Browning. And I had always thought of myself as somebody that gets on with Robert Browning. I use My Last Duchess in a activity on the first day of my first year writing classes for close reading, to show them how to close read and how to read multiple times and get different things out of the poem. But this was rough. This was really rough. I will say it started out fantastic with Porphyria's lover. And like, we're going along and I'm like, okay, we're vibing. He's in love with her. Yep. And then all of a sudden, murder. I was like, oh, okay, that's where we're going with this. So I was like, okay, the rest of this should be pretty good. Not really. I wasn't a fan. A lot of his poems just are too long for me, and I start losing patience. Like, My Last Duchess is the perfect length for a poem, in my opinion. Like, perfect. But a lot of his are really quite long. I did, however, enjoy the Pied Piper of Hamelin, which it's a fairy tale. I knew the story. And I know I have heard his version before, I just don't know where. And then the other ones that I liked, it was one other one. Gold Hair. That was fascinating. And it also had kind of a fairy tale-like quality. So, and those were both on the longer side, but I found them doable. I mean, some of these others though, like Fra Lippo Lippi, I was like, no, I can't do this. This is too long. And I was also rather disappointed with Child Roll Into the Dark Tower came, because this is the poem that partially inspired Stephen King's Dark Tower series. So I was like, oh, this is gonna be good. And I was very confused. I was just like, what is this? So yeah, I'm not a huge Robert Browning fan. I give this 2 stars. There are a few in here that I liked, but overall, it was not for me. Next up is a reread. This is Tess of the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy. I read this back when I was 15 and I needed to reread it again for my exams, and I still really enjoyed this. I did not love it quite as much as when I was 15, but I think Thomas Hardy is a beautiful writer. I enjoyed the story, as heartbreaking as it is. I still really hate Angel Clare. He is awful, like worst person ever, probably my most hated Victorian character in the world is Angel Clare, because he sucks, okay? He's terrible. And he's a hypocrite, and he builds Tess up in his mind as this perfect, pure thing, and then he finds out she's been raped, and he's like, no, my image of you is ruined. And I'm like, shut the F up, you bitch. You had an affair with a woman in London that was consensual, and you're gonna get mad at my girl Tess because douche canoe Alec d'Urberville raped her? No, Angel Clare. Congrats. You are worse in my mind than Alec d'Urberville, who is a pretty despicable person, but at least he doesn't pretend to be a good guy. Well, next up was my pick for Katie's challenge, which was to read a Victorian Bildungsroman. This is the Beth Book by Sarah Grand, and this was by far my favorite book of the month. It follows Beth Caldwell as she goes from childhood into marrying at the age of 16 and ultimately having a very unsuccessful marriage, to then becoming a writer and then an orator, and finding a group of women who nurture her abilities and help her on her way. So this was amazing. I adored it. I gave this 4.5 stars. So much great commentary on marriage at the time. I was underlining like crazy. I read this on my Kindle, so you just have to like press. It's great. Anyway, the only reason it's not a 5-star read is honestly because half of this book is Beth's childhood. Like, actually more than half is her childhood. And the result of that was that I felt like it was kind of rushed at the end. Like, we could have had more time of her as an adult and her journey, and we could have maybe had less of her as a child, because I mean, she was an amusing child, that's for sure, but it did feel kind of painfully detailed sometimes. But overall, it was a fantastic book, and I loved it, and I am going to be writing about it in my dissertation. Next up was another reread. This is Dracula by Bram Stoker. I'm not going to talk much about this because I have a whole video on it and looking at its adaptation, the 1992 Bram Stoker's Dracula. I loved this. I don't know how I zoned out completely the first time I read it and gave it 3 stars. This was fantastic. I gave it 4 stars. Next up is more poetry. And this was a little bit more successful than Robert Browning. This was his wife, Elizabeth Barrett Browning. That's not wrong book. Elizabeth Barrett Browning. So I read Aurora Leigh and other poems. So the majority of this collection is taken up by her epic poem / novel in verse, Aurora Leigh. I really liked the story of Aurora Leigh. It is the story of a woman becoming a writer. Again. Are we sensing a theme? But so I love the story. I liked Aurora Leigh as a character. I was very interested in Marian. Marian, is that her name? Who is a working class poor woman who Aurora's cousin Romney becomes engaged to, and then Marian leaves him at the altar basically, and Aurora meets back up with her while in either France or Italy, I'm not sure which. But so I was very interested in that. My problem was the poetry. And I said this, so my office mate at campus is a poetry person. She does modern American poetry. And I said to her, I'm like, my problem with this is, why did it have to be poetry? Why couldn't it just be a novel? She was like, because it is the oldest literary form, Elizabeth. I'm like, I know, but I don't like it. So yeah, I struggled with the fact that this was poetry. And I would have liked it a lot more if it had just been a novel. It could have just been a novel. I am gonna reread it at some point when I don't need to be reading as fast as I read it, and like try to maybe read it on audiobook, because I do notice I have an easier time with poetry if I read it out loud, and I'm not reading aloud 300 pages of Aurora Leigh, but somebody else can do that for me and I'll listen. So I am gonna reread this at some point and hopefully like it more. The rest of her poems, I was fairly mixed on. Again, I do like some of her sonnets from the Portuguese. I had, How Do I Love Thee? I don't know what number it is. Sang at my wedding. And then there's a poem about her dog, and that was great. Flush, or Faunus. So her dog Flush is actually the subject of a Virginia Woolf novel, which I really want to read. I just really like dogs, okay? And cats. You may remember that when I read Keats a few months ago, my favorite was the sonnet to a cat. Anyway, I gave this collection 3 stars. Maybe I will give Aurora Leigh itself 4 once I listen to it, but that will not be this year. But more successful than Robert Browning. I will give Elizabeth Barrett Browning that. So those are all of the Victorian books that I read in full, but I did read part of a book. This is Victorian short stories, The Trials of Love, edited by Harold Orrell, and I read 2 stories out of this. I read The Little Grey Glove by George Egerton, and then The Adventure of Abbey Grange by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and I think that I got that title right. The Adventure of the Abbey Grange. Yes, I did. So The Little Grey Glove was originally published in Egerton's collection Keynotes. So George Egerton is a woman, that is a pen name. She was considered a New Woman writer. And The Little Grey Glove is a love story, but it's a rather untraditional love story. It is told from the perspective of a man who is on a fishing trip and meets this woman at the inn they're staying at and falls in love with her. But there is a little bit of a snag and things, but I'm not gonna, it's a very short story. I'm not gonna give it away. And then The Adventure of the Abbey Grange is a Sherlock Holmes story. And I remember in my TBR video, I was like, I'm not gonna read any Sherlock Holmes story because I don't need to. But then I was like, I don't think I've read this one before. It was very interesting. So Holmes and Watson are called out to a case at a big manor house, Abbey Grange, where it appears to be a fairly cut and dry situation. Burglars broke in, murdered the man of the house, brutalized the woman of the house, and stole some silver. But of course, Sherlock Holmes was called in, so it's not quite so cut and dry. Anyway, I really enjoyed both of these. I didn't give them ratings, but I would say, I guess Abbey Grange is probably like 4 stars and Little Grey Glove is probably like 3.5. But I don't usually give short stories ratings if they're that short, which they were both quite short. So that is everything that I read for Victober. I got to all of the challenges except one. That was Kate's challenge, which was to read a Victorian work with disability or chronic illness representation. I had planned to reread Dinah Mullet Craik's Olive, but I just wasn't able to get to it, unfortunately. But all of the other challenges I did complete. Roz's challenge of poetry, I got plenty of poetry. Marissa's challenge for a short story, I got 2 of them. Katie's challenge for the Bildungsroman, I read the Beth Book, and actually Aurora Leigh counts as a Bildungsroman as well. And then I did Petra's challenge of reading a novel and watching an adaptation with Dracula and the 1992 film. So I do want to say thank you to all of the hosts. I had a wonderful time. I enjoyed watching everybody's videos. Thank you so much for another great year. And before I go, I do want to briefly talk about the one non-Victorian book that I read. This was a spooky season read, and it was My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. This focuses on Abby and Gretchen, two girls growing up in the 80s in Charleston, South Carolina. And after an incident of Gretchen getting lost in the woods for a whole night, she starts acting very strangely. Almost as if it's not Gretchen, but somebody else who is trying very hard to just make everybody miserable. And it turns out that Gretchen is possessed, and now Abby needs to figure out what she's going to do to save her best friend. I listened to this on audiobook. It was narrated by Emily Wu Zeller, who did a fantastic job. It was so fun. Campy, 80s. It was what I needed this Halloween season. I actually started it in September, but it was just perfect. I had so much fun. I gave this 4 stars. And yeah, I highly recommend it if you need a book for next spooky season, or if you're just like, I kind of miss the campy 80ness of Stranger Things while I'm waiting for the next season. Great book to pick up. Or if you're like, I just want a fun teenage demonic possession story. It's great. There's apparently a movie of it on Netflix, or not Netflix, Amazon Prime right now, which I do want to watch, but I haven't had the chance to yet. All right, so that is everything that I read for Victober and in the month of October. Let me know down in the comments below. Have you read any of these? What did you think? What did you read this month? It has been great chatting with you. I will see you soon. Bye.